Hi, everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with the Daly Express for the final day of the Principles First Summit in Washington, D.C. Things wrapped up a few hours ago. The day did not go as planned, as you may have already read about this online. I had mentioned on yesterday's podcast that a guy named Enrique Tarrio showed up Saturday to try and disrupt the event. Tarrio is the leader of the Proud Boys. He was actually, as I mentioned, convicted and was serving a 22-year sentence for seditious conspiracy for his involvement in the January 6th insurrection. That was up until Donald Trump pardoned him. Tarrio seems to have a personal vendetta against a number of Trump critics, but he has a special hatred, it seems, for the January 6th cops who testified in front of the January 6th committee. That's actually who he showed up to harass yesterday, which was just a day after he was arrested for assaulting a woman at the U.S. Capitol. So yeah, he guess he got out of jail for that incident. Anyway, because of what happened yesterday, there was even more security today for the Principles First Summit. Volunteers were stationed at the escalators and elevators to be on the lookout for Tarrio or any other extremists or people who don't look right. They were checking everyone's credentials quite closely, which is kind of a shame because it's supposed to be sort of a lighthearted summit. But thankfully, there were no security incidents that morning. But during lunchtime, an email came into the principal's first account with a very serious bomb threat. I'll link to the actual email in the show notes, but it was very detailed and it called out specific individuals who were speaking there, including former Capitol Police officer Michael Fanone and his elderly mother. She had just been assaulted a week or two ago by some nut who was yelling that Fanone was a traitor. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but her home address was included in the email. The bomb threat came from an account that had sort of a name that was a takeoff of Enrique Tarrio, with the note that the bombs would go off in honor to the January 6 hostages. Although it has his name, it may not be him, but somebody else possibly messing with things. But needless to say, the Principals First staff and hotel security took the threat very seriously. We were all evacuated upstairs a few levels for quite some time while the police, I saw at least one dog, but there were a ton of cops, searched through things. No bomb was found. Thankfully, I think that's probably what people expected. But I wanted to show a few videos related to that. The first one is from Heath Mayo, the founder and president of Principals First. This is him addressing the audience once we were back from lunch and into the ballroom.
And was yesterday, and this was reported, Enrique Tarrio, who was the head of the Proud Boys and recently sentenced for seditious conspiracy, sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, was pardoned by Donald Trump. He was here yesterday after having been arrested at the Capitol just the day before for assaulting an individual. Was here harassing Harry Dunn, who was here, Michael Fanone, the Capitol Police. We responded to that the evening, upping our security measures with our private security team for the final day today. Today's security concern started at 12:15 p.m. When Principals First received an email from an individual from an account claiming to be Enrique T. It was a credible bomb threat for 4 pipe bombs, three different locations that were named in the email, and it was to honor the J6 hostages recently released by Emperor Trump. Those were the first words in the email. Subject title: Explosive Surprises. So we responded. We took that very seriously. Obviously, we responded. And we evacuated this room. I should say we don't know, we haven't confirmed, obviously, who precisely sent the email. The investigative teams here in Washington, D.C. are working on that, and we'll get to the bottom of it. We will work with them and make everything available to them so that they can track down who was responsible for this and hold them to account. But I just want to say this. It's like I said yesterday, we are not going to be cowed. We are not going to do that. This type of threat to physical safety of us, members of Congress, this is a real problem in the United States of America, and it isn't going to stay.
And now I'm going to play Michael Fanone speaking out later at a press conference. I was actually granted press access to that conference because I was a podcaster. We all had the same credentials. So the other attendees weren't allowed into the room, but I was there and took this video.
Email that was received by Principals First today listing my mother's address and stating that she was in fact the target of a bomb. My ex-wife, the mother of my youngest 3 children, my father, and my sister, as well as my mother additionally today, have all been targeted in similar incidents, whether swatting incidents or are receiving an inundation of threatening phone calls, emails, and text messages. And let me just let the American people know this has been my life for the past 4 years. This is not a new occurrence. This is not something that that is a recent development. Each and every time I do an interview with one of you, each and every time I appear on television, each and every time I speak about my experiences on January 6th at events like these, this is what my family has to endure.
The quote that gets me there, this has been my life for the past 4 years. I think those words are very important to listen to. Imagine this man's life from his perspective. He showed up to work on January 6th, 2021 to protect the Capitol. He had no political agenda. He wasn't expecting to become a household name, but he was severely beaten that day. He was tossed to the concrete. He nearly died. And because he had the gall to speak out about his experience that day, he and his family have been targeted ever since. I said someone assaulted his elderly mom recently. This nut ran up to her screaming that her son was a traitor. He threw a bag of excrement in her face. And today, because her home address was included in the bomb threat, the police went to her house and searched it for bombs. You know, it's important to remember that the people who assaulted cops that day, not just Fanone, but at least 150 others, have all been pardoned. So that's a constant worry, not just of Michael Fanone and his family, but for other cops from that day. To me, this is unbelievable that Fanone has gone through this. He has been screwed over in every way imaginable, denied of any real justice for what's happened to him. And he and his family are constantly looking over their shoulders. One of the other individuals, speakers, was who was mentioned specifically in the bomb threat was former National Security Advisor John Bolton. He was actually scheduled to be the next speaker today after lunch. He was going to go on stage then, but as people know, Bolton's already at risk. The president removed him from from Secret Service protection, and like Michael Fanone's mother, his home address was listed in the bomb threat email. So he had to have cops come to his house as well. So he canceled the appearance at the event, understandably, and the whole incident put us a couple hours behind. I had planned to interview a number of speakers today. That didn't happen. The security situation made extra access to them difficult. And because everything was delayed, the speakers had other things they needed to get going to. So I did get one interview in when I first got there this morning. It's with a guy named Melvin Edwards. He's a Twitter friend, a fellow author, a fellow podcaster. A very cool guy. I'm going to include my conversation with him at the very end of today's episode. But next, I want to include some videos from some of the forums that day, some of the discussions on stage. The first one is Greg Nunziata, I think is his name. He's a conservative lawyer. I followed him for a while. He's a very sharp legal mind. He talks here about Congress letting the executive branch have too much power.
The weakness of Congress is a bit of a bipartisan problem. One of the most tragic things of the last several years, to me, in this whole area, was after the first Trump term, there was a bipartisan effort to put some limits on presidential power and to restore congressional powers. A couple of bipartisan team of former White House counsels teamed up, former executive branch lawyers teamed up to do this, Bob Bauer, Jeff Goldsmith. There was a package of bills that Democrats were championing in Congress called the Protecting Our Democracy Act. As soon as there was a Democrat in the president, they lost interest. They had a Democrat in the White House, and Democrats were all of a sudden opposed to strengthening Congress again and putting checks in the presidency. Americans need to stop thinking about politics as just a team sport. I know all of you in this room understand that. We need to stop Congress, we need to eliminate executive.
Next is conservative New York Times columnist David French. He's been on with Bernie and I before. There's a couple of clips with him. He's talking about politics infiltrating Christianity here in America and in a pretty big way.
In the Christian movement right now, and who really has his ear is not actually the Franklin Graham types as much, although Franklin Graham obviously does to some extent. It's not the classic old school Southern Baptists, for example, or Presbyterians. It's part of this movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. It's a Pentecostal movement that is drenched in prophecy about Donald Trump, just drenched in it. And so, whereas you might have, say, at a Baptist or a Presbyterian convention, this sort of idea that, well, God is in control and God is sovereign, and it's sort of a general, taken as a general truism, with the Pentecostal prophecies around it, it's not a general God is in control. It is God has picked this person for this time. And by the way, because God has picked this person for this time, that means if you are opposing Trump, you are opposing God. You are on the side of Satan. So if you have Trump, who's already steeped in this friend-to-enemy dynamic anyway, I mean, right now, the reality of American public policy, both at home and abroad, is if you're friends with Donald Trump, you're friends with the American government. If you're not friends with Donald Trump, you are not friends with the American government. And this is something that's deeply inculcated in him. And what message would be more inclined to sort of prick his ear in the spiritual sense than one that says, you are God's man, everyone who's opposing you is opposing God's plan for America. And I'm glad you began with that because it really introduces the point I wanted to make. The level of fanaticism that we are now seeing in the American, broader, it's disproportionately in Pentecostalism, but not exclusively in Pentecostalism. The level of fanaticism we are now seeing around Donald Trump is unlike anything that I have seen, including anything I've seen in the Trump era. It's just escalating, and it's escalating around these supernatural prophecies and this sort of sense of divine mission, divine protection, divine sanction around the person of Donald Trump. An actual person with some notoriety in the Christian nationalist world actually tweeted this out not long ago. The creeds and confessions are not enough. If you want to know if your church is sound, ask your pastor what he thinks of David French. And if he likes me, run away from that church. This actually happened in the world. It's utterly bizarre.
That's it. That's in the New Testament. Who do you say for David French?
The man David French is with is Russell Moore, a Christian theologian who talks on the same topic as David did.
I started hearing from pastors who would say, whenever they kind of parenthetically quoted from the Sermon on the Mount, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek, that people would come up afterward and say, where did you get those liberal talking points? Jesus Christ. And what was most disturbing about a lot of these stories is that when the pastor said, I'm quoting from Matthew, The response is not, oh, I'm sorry. It was, well, yeah, that was fine for then, but we're in a state of emergency right now. So we're in a hostile culture, so those things don't apply. As though Jesus were delivering the Sermon on the Mount in Mayberry instead of in the Roman Empire.
Next, we have the dispatch crew. I talked to Steve Hayes the day before, but now it was in this case on stage. It was Michael Warren, Jonah Goldberg, along with Stephen Hayes. They talked in a couple clips here about the topic of truth and how it's no longer valued or it seemingly even cared about, especially when it comes to the world of politics.
This morning, an interview with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Shannon Bream, our old colleague Shannon Bream. And Hegseth was asked a few questions about Ukraine. And the back and forth was, if I'm summarizing, is it the case that Russia invaded Ukraine? Can't you just say that Russia invaded Ukraine? And Hegseth gave sort of a series of kind of dodging answers and ended by saying, this is all very complicated. So I question to you first, Jonah. Is this very complicated?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. I was really kind of hoping I'd be on a panel with somebody else, but
Why would he incite Mike Warren like that? I mean,
Mike's fine. Yeah, so like, this is, there's this great passage from Confucius where he talks about how society, when names stop being descriptors of reality, society goes crazy. And that's why he calls for the rectification of the names. And the simple, put it this way, the real gaslighting that is going on isn't about this or that discrete issue or whether or not a hurricane was going to hit Alabama or whatever the outrage du jour things that Trump says, right? Or whether or not Zelensky's poll numbers are low. All of those lies matter and they bother me. And and if you had told me 30 years ago that I would be one of these dudes wagging his finger about the importance of truth, I would have been really offended. Not because I'm against truth 30 years ago, but just because I wasn't one of those finger waggy kind of types. I was the kind of guy that would want to smash your guitar against the Delta House wall. And now, like, I think truth is like the most important thing, but the real gaslighting that's going on now isn't about any discrete lie. It's about the idea itself that any of this is complicated. That, look, Washington in politics right now, it makes no sense. It's like a wacky Japanese game show. They must know behind the scenes what they're doing. There has to be some sort of master plan. Like even a lot of Trump's opponents and critics, somehow deep down, because they want to impose order on a chaotic world, sometimes, he's got a master plan, he's up to something, and it's really complicated, and here's my 3-point theory about what it is. And the reality is that for 90% of this stuff, it's really base lizard brain crap. It is just, like my friend Eli Lake makes this really important point that there's a difference between lying and bullshit. Because lying is kind of a sign of respect to the truth. The liar knows what the truth is and is denying it in a very specific way. The bullshitter just doesn't care whether something is true or false. It is just, you will throw out half-truths, whole truths, partial truths, this truth, that truth, or whole lies or any other flavor just to make people feel like nothing, that the truth is just an afterthought, right? Just to get what you want. That's the MO of this administration, basically. It is looking for loyalists. It is looking to have its way about everything. Trump has very, very basic sort of mob boss attitudes about foreign policy, and it's sort of like that scene in the Blues Brothers, what kind of music do you play here? Well, we got both kinds, country and western, right? He's got a sort of a mob boss attitude towards politics and sort of international affairs and domestic affairs. And other than that, not much else. And, or I guess also business. So, but the desire to say it's complicated, right? You get these guys on all the Sunday shows talking about how it's very complicated about whether or not who started this war, right? And it's not complicated. It's not complicated how those babies died in Gaza. It's just very straightforward, and it takes a modicum of political courage just to tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient to your own side. And that is what is so profoundly lacking these days.
Than before? And have we gotten to the point where perception matters as much as reality in some cases? They can sort of create this alternative reality. And that's what the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, uses to make his decisions. Have we reached this point where perception matters as much as reality? Mike?
I think we have, and I don't like saying that because I like to be an optimistic person, but I think we're at a moment where it is just patently obvious that there are decisions being made, that we have sort of an administration that is sort of run on. Go back to the campaign. I mean, go back to this most recent campaign. We had, what was that, weeks of kind of debate about whether immigrants were eating cats in Springfield, Ohio. I mean, that's a great example where it didn't really matter whether it was true. It didn't really matter whether whether the mayor of Springfield was trying to talk about, hey, we actually welcome these migrants here because they've done good things for our community. What was important was the bigger point that immigration was out of control and that the Biden administration had been too, permissive on these sorts of things. I mean, the actual facts on the ground should have mattered,
and
they didn't.
Vance at one point almost acknowledged this, right?
Yes.
He says, look, it helped us. It helped us make this bigger political point. I mean, conservatives used to be the people who objected to fake but accurate. That's what Dan Rather did, right?
That's right.
That's how he rationalized. He used forged documents to make an argument on 60 Minutes that weren't true. But used to care about that. Jonah?
Yeah, so I've talked and written about this a bunch. I deserve some small portion of the blame for the American rights obsession with Saul Alinsky. I was one of the first guys to write about the problem with Alinskyites, and my first book, I talked about how Hillary Clinton was sort of this.
Can you just give us a?
So Saul Alinsky was a very effective community organizer, right? Remember that phrase? How big that was? Who basically believed in sort of say whatever you need to say, demonize whoever you need to demonize in order to win your fight. And he was an influence on Barack Obama, he was an influence on Hillary Clinton. I probably emphasized it too much. But I said, I argued that one of the problems with the left is how much they've internalized this Alinskyite stuff. And I watched it happen in real time, where I said Alinsky was bad. I pointed out that one of the dedications in Rules for Radicals, that's his most famous book, is to Lucifer, which I thought was kind of a tell. And
Jonah, that's complicated.
and I watched in real time as the right went from saying, the left always wins because they're Alinskyites, to we have to be Alinskyites too. And I'm not saying that like J.D. Vance has studied Alinsky or anything like that, but Dinesh D'Souza's pushed this argument, all these kind of people push this argument, and you can watch in real time over the last 15 years or so that the right went from criticizing the left for its abuses of power and truth to saying the only way we can beat the left is to do the exact same thing.
Well, that's it for my three-part episode of the Daily Express at Principles First. I had a great time here despite today's big disruption. It was great catching up with some friends from last year. I also had a nice conversation with Tim Miller from The Bulwark. He's a hard hitter when it comes to politics, and I don't always agree with him, but I've met him in person twice now. He's a fellow Coloradoan from my home state. And both times I've met him, he was great to me, as friendly as can be. And of course, as I said in the first episode, it was fun meeting some online friends for the first time in person. There were quite a few of them this time, including subscribers to Bernie's website and subscribers to the podcast. The annual event here is probably the only place on the planet in which I'm viewed as sort of a pseudo celebrity. It's kind of wild, actually, mostly for my political writings, some for my tweets on Twitter. But it's funny to walk around and have so many people kind of walk up to you and say, "Are you John Daly? I love your." I'm like, really? Because I usually don't hear a lot of positive feedback, but apparently, I have some fans out there, which is great to hear. Whenever I tell this to my family, they just kind of roll their eyes at me. But it's true. At Principles First, I'm kind of a big deal. So no, pseudo big deal. So thanks everyone for listening. I hope you found this stuff in the last 3 podcasts interesting, insightful, and maybe even a little bit entertaining. I'm going to wrap things up, as I said before, with my interview of fellow author and podcaster Melvin Edwards. Take care, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm here today with Melvin Edwards. He is a fellow podcaster. His podcast is Stories from Real Life. This is not your first Principles First, is it? This is your second.
This is my second. I came to the original one in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. So this is the first time I've been back since then.
Okay. What are your big takeaways this year? Did you see anybody in particular you enjoyed listening to? I know you were pretty busy with your podcast stuff. We're working with that the other day, but anybody who stands out?
Well, I didn't get a chance to hear a whole lot of the speakers yesterday, but I did get to hear Gary Kasparov, and he's always compelling. Knowing his background coming from the Soviet Union and seeing some of the things that he remembers from that time, from his youth, unfortunately happening here in America, that was jarring.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting when I hear people who lived in Russia, who understood this stuff. Kathy Young from the Bulwark's another one, who I think is able to write about these topics in a way that it's just a unique perspective. And it's disheartening to see that disheartening to hear that perspective, because it is such a bad situation now. What are your big thoughts on Ukraine and Russia? Do you see things as continuing to get worse, or do you think this is a lot of it's bluster that Donald Trump will ultimately decide not to do some of the crazy stuff he's talking about doing?
Well, I honestly don't know from Donald Trump's side, but I know from Putin's side. It's certainly not bluster, obviously, with him going into invading Ukraine 3 years ago. And even though he's essentially on the edge of bankruptcy and being brought out of that by the new Trump administration, his stated intention is not just Eastern Ukraine, it's all of Ukraine, and eventually reinstituting the Soviet Union. He talked about that for 25 years. So I don't think that was just a bluster. I think that's his objective. And I don't want to create any conspiracy theories or repeat any, but whether Trump is on his side or just complicit based on a number of factors,
right?
It really doesn't matter. The outcome could be the same. And I'm really concerned that Ukraine could become just the beginning of Eastern Europe being swept up by the Russians and the Romanians and the Turks, and so all those oligarchs, authoritarians in that part of the world, along with China now having some authority to go into, or at least not authority, but just the leeway without any pushback to go into Taiwan. I'm really concerned about the balance of world power now.
No, I think that's exactly right, and that's a common theme that a lot of the speakers are talking about today. That a lot of people, come in with this attitude of, what do I care about Ukraine? What is it? Beyond the, humanitarian stuff, I mean, people should care about Ukraine, but it really is part of a bigger picture, as you mentioned, with Taiwan and other places in the world. I wanted to talk about your podcast, Stories from Real Life. I know it's I've listened to a couple episodes. Very interesting. It's kind of takes a sort of a very laid back look into people's lives. Can you talk about it more?
Yeah, I love storytelling. I love telling stories. I've been a writer my whole life. Started out as a newspaper reporter, eventually became a speechwriter. PR writing, and an author of a couple of books. So I love telling stories, and I love listening to other people's stories too. And one of the things that I think I'm personally really good at is asking questions that draw out information from people. People love to talk about themselves, but they tend to be a little bit uptight when they do it. So I do some research on my guest and ask them questions, one or two questions early on that they wouldn't have expected, like maybe finding out where they went to high school and talking about their high school mascot or something unusual like that, or what a Friday night was like in their town. And that tends to allow them to let their guard down, and then they start sharing their stories more freely. And my point is for people to see that no matter how much success someone has had, they're just ordinary people. And they once had whatever they succeeded at accomplishing was just once a goal. And I hope to use that as motivation and inspiration for people who have a dream that they haven't had the courage to go after, to maybe say, well, if this person can do it, I can do it too.
Yeah, no, it's a great listen. I definitely recommend people doing that. I also recommend people following you on Twitter. It's a lot it's a lot of fun. I like how you start the morning. Good morning, everyone, except, and then kind of choose out somebody. But yeah, no, it's so today is the last day of the Principals First Summit. Are you looking forward to seeing any particular speakers today over other ones?
I'm definitely looking forward to seeing Russell Moore. I'm a Christian, and I consider him a sort of a hero in the faith. I admire courage above all other human traits, and he's demonstrated a quiet courage that I think most people overlook. To be singled out by name by the President of the United States has to be the most intimidating thing that can happen to you. And he's been singled out by name by Donald Trump on multiple occasions for not going along because Trump thinks he owns evangelicals.
Right.
And unfortunately, he owns about 82% of at least the white evangelicals in the last election. And Russell Moore has remained firm in his faith, and he's been gracious in the way he's dealt with opponents. I don't like to say enemies, but his political opponents. And he's paid a price for it, a personal price. And I'm interested in hearing what he's got to say, and I hope to have him as a guest on my podcast to ask him some other questions, because I just want to know how he's doing, and want to know how I can pray for him, and how other people can pray for him, and how we can pray for each other. And we're not going to make it through this period by wringing our hands. We've got to figure out how to come together across the spectrum, do what needs to be done for the greater good, not for our individual selves or for our small group of people or even our political parties. This is much, much bigger than that. This is a moment in history that future generations will look back on and say, what side was your grandfather on, your ancestor?
No, I think that's very well said. Yeah, it's been disheartening to kind of see how politicized Christianity has become in this nation. And yeah, you're right. I mean, Russell Moore has been a strong voice on this. It's you wouldn't think it would require a strong voice to do what he's doing, but basically separate politics from religion. I mean, it seemed like prior to Donald Trump, it was pretty easy to do that. But yeah, no, that's great. But I want to thank you for coming on, Melvin. I want people to check out your podcast. I'm going to put the link to it in the show notes. I'm also going to put your Twitter account so people get stories from real life. Melvin, it was great meeting you in real life. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the rest of the day and looking forward to getting to know you and having you on my podcast.
Excellent. I'm ready for it. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot,
Bye.
John.